Hello, welcome back to 10 at 10. My name is Michael Ramage. I'm the director of the Cyber Education Research Center here at Murray State University, and welcome back to 10 at 10. 10 at 10 is brought to you through a partnership between Murray State University, Grow West, the Technology Council of West Kentucky, KY Innovation, and local partner Sprocket Innovation in Paducah and the Kentucky Innovation Station in Madisonville. So, episode 165, welcome back. As you can probably hear it in my voice, I'm playing a little hurt today. Hope to make it through and without have any coughing fits. But let's get started. We started our fourth year of doing 10 at 10 by looking at 5 things that we can do to make our organization safer. And these are 5 things that aren't break the bank things that we can do to really just make our organization safer and come from a better place or be better in this new cybersecurity world that we find ourselves in. So the first one was creating a security policy. Nobody enjoys creating policy, but that's the first thing we need to do. We need to start there so that we know what we're judging ourselves against. It's really that simple. Next, we talked about passwords and we talked about two-factor authentication and using password vaults, using strong, unique passwords. We talked about all of that. Last week, we actually talked about news of the week. The week before, we talked about improving user education. That is extremely important. Number 4 is auditing against policy and regulations. And the point of this week, and we're going to talk about audit or assessment or what's the difference, how do they work? You may not need an audit, you may need an assessment, and we'll talk about that. But the point of this is if you don't test yourselves against some standard, then how do you know you're doing the right thing? You can go to some conference and see some cool thing and come back and say, oh, this is what I need to do. But it may not be. It may not be what meets the industry best practices. And let me tell you, industry best practices are probably better in general than what any individual can think about. In reality, it may be that, oh, I forgot about this category or subcategory altogether. So that's why we use it. So again, the big question is, do I do an audit or do I do an assessment? And first of all, there's pros and cons of both. Audits are typically going to be more expensive than assessment. That doesn't mean you ignore audits. But let's talk about assessment first. An assessment can be done by an internal or a third party team. If it's an internal team, then if they know what they're doing, then it can be a cheaper alternative. Um, but it is a check in advance and in preparation for a security audit. Let me give you an example. CMMC is a standard that if you want to do business with DoD, you have to meet. In order to get CMMC level 2 certified, you have to have an external auditor. If you're wanting to do that, I don't want you to go pay the $30,000 or $50,000 for an auditor to come in. I don't know what the number is. It's going to depend on computers and workstations and size of company and a lot of different factors. But I don't want you to pay some enormous amount of money to come in for them to say that here's the 58 things that you're not doing. Where if you did an assessment, an internal assessment, even you could say, okay, we need to do these things before we go do an audit. That's the idea of an assessment. There's a high level look at compliance. It examines your network security, your disaster recovery, your protections, your general data security, all of those basic things that you should be doing in your cybersecurity plan. An assessment would be able to make sure that you're doing those. An audit is typically a third party. They need to be qualified or certified. Going back to that CMMC example, if you don't get audited by a CMMC certified auditor, then it's not really going to matter what they say. You've got to make sure that you're going to hire and work with somebody that's qualified to do that. Second part, audit is checking with compliance. And it's checking compliance with a specific set of external legal standards or guidelines. So I am checking to see if you are following CMMC requirements. I am checking to see if you are following HIPAA requirements or FERPA, or I'll show some other examples in a minute. It examines all your technology, all your controls, all your policies, all your procedures, and it checks to see if you're doing what you say you're doing. If you say that you're doing backups and you're doing, incremental backups, and you're doing monthly full backups or weekly and monthly and quarterly full backups, then the auditor may come in and say, show me where your quarterly backups are. And then, maybe you're saying you're keeping those backups for 6 months. So they may come in and say, okay, I want to see the backup that is 5 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days old. Let me see it. If you can't produce that, well, then that's going to be a knock against you on your audit. It is checking to see, one, that you meet the requirements that you say you're following, and two, are you actually doing it? There are a whole host, and this is only a fraction of them, of frameworks of compliance standards that you can follow. If you're in certain states, you may have frameworks. If you are in certain industries, you may have frameworks. If you're accepting electronic transactions, you're going to have certain framework. There's a whole host of frameworks and requirements for you based on the industry that you're in. If you don't necessarily follow any of these, one that I would recommend, and we talked about it the last few weeks, is the NIST cybersecurity framework. NIST just released the end of February their 2.0 framework. So what does that mean? So the NIST cybersecurity framework creates a common, understandable framework that you can follow. It can be adapted to a lot of different areas. It's based on risk, which is really what cybersecurity is today. You're not going to eliminate all threats. You're not. I don't care who you are, how much money you have, what business you have. You can't eliminate all risk. You can lower risk. You can lower risk to an acceptable level, but you're not going to eliminate 100% all risk. It's based on international standards. It's a living document. It's guided by a lot of different perspectives, including private sector, public sector, academia. And if you look over to the right, you can see what this framework looks like. The biggest change in the graphic representation is that they added the word governance or govern, that inner yellow circle of govern. That govern component talks about the policies and the compliance um, component, that making sure that governance, risk, compliance, that overarching umbrella, that you're doing the things that you say that you're going to do. You're not just protecting um, your assets, but you're doing it with a strategy, with a plan in mind. And that's an important piece that often we forget. The way that it breaks down is that there's these functional areas: govern, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. They map to categories and they map to subcategories. And each of those subcategories has things that you should do in order to protect yourself. It also maps to other standards. There's plenty of standards that you can follow. The goal of the cybersecurity framework from NIST is to make sure that you're mapping to industry best practices. Oops, wrong way. All right. So the way that you essentially start out is that you're going to start out with scoping your organizational profile. What does your organization look like? What's its mission statement? What's its risk tolerance? What do you need to do? Based on that, you're going to need to gather information. Based on that, number three, you create your organizational profile. If you don't know what the organizational profile is, it's going to be really hard to build an action plan. So once you build that profile, you identify the gaps, create an action plan, and then ultimately you implement that action plan. If you notice that this framework is a circle, Once you finish those 5 things, you review it, you make sure that that's still what makes sense for your organization, and you continue to work on it. That's how it works. It's that simple. Well, I say it's that simple. It's really not simple at all, but it is something that is important for you to do. It is easy to understand what you're doing. It's much harder and more complicated to implement it. Anyway, assessments, audits, again, not exciting things. You can start off with assessments, fairly inexpensive, and then build from there. If your organization doesn't know what to do, what framework to measure against, start with the cybersecurity framework from NIST. It's a great first start, and one that I recommend to a lot of organizations. If you have questions on this, please don't hesitate to let me know. I appreciate your time today, and indulging my patience on my voice. But thank you for joining, and I'll see you next week back here on 10 at 10. Thank you. Bye.